Okay, so I wanted to record kind of all the things that I kind of remembered or resonated from when I was from when I went to COP, and not just COP, from when I went to the RGS conference, the RGS Explore conference, COP, even the Remembrance Sunday service that I went to afterwards, because I just want to. I don't want to lose those feelings, because I can already feel them dissipating, and a lot of the time I need to record those thoughts when they're closest to the surface, when they're just kind of literally just kind of emanating or radiating out, because then it's the urgency. Well, it just makes you sharper, doesn't it? And it's imminent, like the feelings and the thoughts and the ideas and and the catalyst that you feel within yourself is imminent. But I didn't do that. One, I think it was so heavy. I felt like emotionally, physically, intellectually exhausted. And yes, been working a lot. Yes, those things were present prior, but it was just the absolute kind of like weight. You know, literally, like you've got a millstone around you, and then you're just like plummeting through the sea to the bottom of the earth. Do you know what I mean? But you're not even trying to swim up, because just the weight of it, the absolute weight of what it is, it's a release just to sink to some extent. And I had to force myself to kind of feel what I was feeling and let it sink through, because the first thing I wanted to do was to just distract or go in another direction or compartmentalise it and not really deal with it. You know what I mean? Read something or look at something or watch something or whatever it is, because it was just like, I just want to take myself away from what feels just concrete in the monolithic way that this is playing out. You know, so let's talk about it. So COP, let's be transparent, let's be honest. So going to COP, I flew there. I remember looking at trains, looking at when you go, trying to find sleeper trains, all these different kinds of things, and just could not afford that price. Could not afford the price whatsoever. But added on accommodation to it, couldn't do it either. And then, then the expense, not expense, but then the weight then also on family in terms of childcare and different things. My husband, who's been covering me so much, my family covers me so much and helps me so much with my practice and everything. I was just like, and they were still helping me that day, even just going for the day. I was up and out by like 3:30 in the morning, 4 a.m. in the morning, and then back by like midnight, and that was still my family helping me out massively. So to make that into consecutive days as well was just, I thought, too much just for that piece. So then I was looking at, right, how can I offset that, or how can I mitigate that effect? So whether that's investing in projects, whether that's carbon offsetting, which I'm really not sure about. I try reading these things, but I find it so difficult to wade through to find the truths, the collective or the many, that are at play, to know what's sincere or what's real and what's not. And I think just generally in life, but increasingly with this kind of subject, if you're talking about climate, biodiversity loss, so many different things, so many of like the weights of the world that are permanently here anyway, because there's always something in terms of our presence here. And so looking at that, I was looking at other projects to invest, and I think I know what I'm going to pick to do that. But I think many times it could be the criticism that definitely that then you shouldn't have gone in any case. But it's like many things, say for example with field work and things, and it's like to go and to witness, to bear witness, which is what it felt like to me. It was like, I need to go. When is it going to be another opportunity, when this is going to be in my country, where it's being hosted, where it's the least amount that in terms of travel or even expense to be able to get there, to be able to see it. So it's local essentially, but also that I feel these things are transformative. They have immediacy in terms of how they resonate with you, and it's the intimacy of those details, the sensuality of those details, which are so indicative and central to the transformational, transformative act of you bearing witness, and then how you internalize that, and then how you change your practice, your philosophies, your values in accordance with it, which already has had a major impact with me. And I'm thinking how, taking things forward, thinking about kind of ethics and sustainability, and how this experience has impacted on those, and making me think about those kind of things and how that's prioritized. So, and I think the same thing for, one of the things I appreciate the arguments in terms of not travelling. I think there's a difference in terms of whether we were taking walk or holidays, or whether we're talking work, or I don't know. Even then, I find that difficult because to take the time to have an experience that's transformative. Some of the things that I worry about, I think, when people talk about not travelling, is then having this isolationist perspective, where if you only stay where you're local, how are you really able to connect with others, to understand what's happening there, what you do affects them, and vice versa? How are you really able to make that resonance, especially if you're talking about any section of society that isn't engaged with the same kind of interests and the same kind of passions or critical issues or whatever it is that you're interested in? Do you know what I mean? Like the fervency and the sensuality of your care or your passion or your position or your fight or your strength or your struggle comes through intense resonance with your lived experience many times, not the only way, but many times. And I know for me, intensively, that the sensory experience of what you have completely changes the decisions that I make going forward. And I, because of that, and when I open myself to those things, I open myself always to the idea that the trajectory of your life, of your practice, of whatever it is, of the way you may take yourself forward will change, maybe, or potentially will change, because it's because of what that means. So I just thought it felt like this was a life-changing moment. And I think for many times, every time of things like this, it's like, this is the one, and it's not the one, because in the sense that from what people are saying in terms of the changes that were made. But for me, it was a key space there, and I realise I'm speaking of myself a bit, but I mean many times that's position from where you stand, and then seeing the world, and then how you engage with it. So I found that really, really difficult. I found that contention, the position, really difficult. But I found that many times when you feel like you're priced out of sustainability, environmentalism, where it feels like it's very class based or privilege based, because if finances are an issue, if childcare or caring responsibilities are an issue, if gender is an issue, all these different kinds of things, the different barriers that can stop you from engaging in things, then especially with a lot of things like this, it feels many times with environmental or these kind of ecological kind of like issues, from products to whatever it is that you do get priced up, but slowly those prices are coming down, or slowly those barriers are moving in a way that they do become more accessible from language also, I think, as well, and the way people engage. Because I think many times when you're part of specific communities, groups of societies, you don't always know how much your language can be quite alienating or isolating or a barrier in and of itself. And I think I find that sometimes within environmental kind of stuff, again, using that example of travel, and some people say, you shouldn't travel, but you know what, if your family, if you live in multiple nation states, if you live a transnational life in the sense that, for example, I'm a citizen of 2 countries, not just this, Barbados and Britain, but for many people in this country, they maintain their links with the places that they've either emigrated from, or their homelands, or their culture, or their heritages, especially if the place where you live hasn't been a welcoming one, historically, intergenerationally, for many different reasons, or even now, depending where you live. So and then going back and forth depending on the infrastructure of that country, you're providing for family, like financially, culturally, you know what I mean? You may be providing things in many different circumstances. So going back home is not like you're going on holiday, you know what I mean? It's very different. It's like you're going home, you're caring for family, you're caring for community. Many times people are sending money home, and the remittance in this country is huge. So when people say don't travel, like there's a guilt that's associated with that, but also a kind of alienation, I think, for particular communities where they're heavily linked and migrate between, different countries and spaces, culturally, economically, linguistically, socially, psychologically, physically in many ways. And therefore, that's very different. They're actively probably contributing to those economies as well, and mitigating the effects of climate change, especially if those are things that are happening within their communities where they've come from. You know what I mean? So I think I think sometimes the accessibility, even in the terms of language and the way things are put forward, isn't open to people necessarily that are from different heritages, different cultures that live in different ways. Than one when you can say maybe if you're only based in the UK or your family in here, that you don't have the same implications in terms of not travelling, for example. But I also think, that I think is a positive as well, because these people are connected to other countries, seeing the real world implications of climate change. They have incredible kind of knowledge systems that that are hybridized, because maybe you're living in Britain and but you're also based in Pakistan or in India or Angola or whatever it is. So you're seeing these things and this phenomena play out in more, in different nation states. You're seeing what's happening on the ground. You have actually, what's happening. This, like, maybe what these strategies are, the governmental strategies are for mitigating climate change or infrastructure, all these different kind of things. So there's so much knowledge in the UK from the communities that are here because of their very things, because of this colonial past in many ways, that, I just think if we could tap into, you have a real world kind of active live knowledge systems in place of understanding where those links are, of understanding how communities are being effective, understanding about displacement, understanding about that kind of impact of diversity loss. You know what I mean? So I just fear that sometimes when we take an isolationist perspective, when open up and really engage with these communities. And I think many times this is another aspect of how the social justice issue comes in, because if those communities, rather than alienated or marginalised or disenfranchised, are ones that are included and inclusive of our national story and our national heritage and the way in which we do things, and you see the wealth that's there because of the links they have, not in a diplomatic sense in terms of like governmental links, but because real application of like communities, the ecology between the communities that is inherent in living now, and what that means and how that changes things. I just think that's extraordinary, and to work with those knowledge systems and to understand where people are coming from in those ways and how they're being affected, I just think would provide such incredible insight. And I think it's that kind of scholarship of the undercommons, really, this idea of many communities that may be invisible or silenced or not recognised or are acknowledged, are the ones that have incredible knowledge systems that are fervent and alive and incredible once you make connections and you get to know them. I think just from people that I know, whether they Ghanaian, Nigerian people, Guyanese, all these different people, and understanding the countries that they come from, the communities that they come from, the heritages they come from, the indigenous communities or societies that are in those countries, the insight you get through those relationships is extraordinary. And if working together with them, we can strategies can emerge that can actively address and act, with in terms, many times I assume in kind of like grassroots movement kind of capacity to address the challenges that we have. I think that would be an extraordinary vision, an extraordinary practice of collectivity and humanity in terms of natural communities, in terms of that connection. And it really impacts maybe on how you live, or maybe being overly ideal. Travelling to COP, I think the first session was the one that still felt like it was very much Welsh led, which it was, and it had these amazing films and this young girl, running around in school, and what may have been her, family or friends, whatever, and this woman being seen only by her, like this kind of representation of nature, if you like. And when the girl would see her, like flowers would come out of her mouth, like almost kind of connect to this beautiful kind of animation. And to me, I think many times it's like, how the child sees innocence and stuff, the child sees nature. And I think that absolutely that is true, in that kind of very elemental sense that you have of children. But to me, that intergenerational connection and living of nature, because I do think many times people talk about the disconnect nature. I do think many times, you also talk about a very Western Eurocentric perspective where there's a disconnect with nature. In many countries, in many societies, there is very strong connections with nature. I think the subsequent sessions that I went to, especially one by the indigenous communities where it was led by them, that was central to every tenet of what they were talking about, was their cosmologies and the link there of nature in terms of their practice, in terms of their stewardship of nature, in terms of their resonance, lived experience, all these different kinds of things. So it's so I know those blanket kind of statements and assuming that kind of disconnect with nature I find difficult sometimes, because different people's experiences and how that comes forward, I mean, take very different places. And for me, when I saw that girl, I saw corals and sea fans and sea eggs coming out of, my kind of child's mouth, if that's the case. And I just, I don't know, I find that hard sometimes. There's not always so much in the language, the open embrace actually to bring others in. And I don't think that's malicious. I don't think that's, but I just think it's because of the subjectivity of people's experiences. But then it's sort of put forward as a generalised, homologous kind of reflection of many, when it is maybe the reflection of many, but not of all, which is different, and and can put you in contention sometimes, I think. So seeing that girl, I saw that, and then they were talking about radical hope and things like that, like changing of value systems and how we can come to know how to do that. I just thought, I said to the lady and in the session, to me, I've seen that and lived that with, within black communities. I think you see that all the time with like black liberation movements. Well, I think any kind of liberatory kind of practice, really, in that kind of sense, radical hope is always central to it, because otherwise why are you doing it? Especially so many times when you think you're coming up against insurmountable odds, abolition, I think, resistance, from enslavement. If you didn't have radical hope that one day you and yours would be freed in that context, how the bloody hell are you ever going to do that? It's central. The radical hope, and the more oppressive the regime or the paradigm or whatever it is, the greater that radical hope has to be, the greater the light has to be, the greater the illumination of what a positive future could possibly be, and that you're fighting for, especially the incremental movement of slowly going forward, which, as so many say, we don't have time now with what's happening in terms of climate and biodiversity. And so that shook me. And I thought it was extraordinary, those films. I thought it was extraordinary what was shown. And, I'm tired of hearing about this weight, placing it on the young. It's not their responsibility. It's an intergenerational responsibility. And, whether people think like it's not our fault or whatever it is, I mean, it's irrespective now, really, isn't it? I mean, everyone, that's the kind of things of ancestral legacies and ancestral futures, is that everyone's responsible in terms of like the sins of your father, if you like, but also for futures, you know what I mean? We manage the gardens that were planted by those that came before us, but we are also responsible for maintaining it for those that are to come. So if a load of like invasive species weeds or whatever it is that's destroying everything, we have to take responsibility for that. We have to be the interrupters and different things, but at the same time, what we may contribute to this kind of burgeoning chaos that's in this garden is something that we've got to also take responsibility for, or try and I don't know, manipulate, maybe mold, transform, all these different kinds of things. So the future is very much ancestral in that concept, and I think that definitely reflected in that Where the Leaves Fall publication that I read when I was going on this sort of kind of COP kind of supporting manifesto and things, and it's for me it's everyone's responsibility. No matter who you are, you're breathing, you're here, you need to be contributing. Do you know what I mean? I also think it adds to this ageism, this inbuilt obsolescence of youth, where when you hit a certain age, if you haven't made it, if you haven't done this, that and the other, again, a very Western concept, I would say, then you are not, then you need to step aside for the next one. And it's not about stepping aside, it's about the longevity and the journey of that individual, of the intergenerational kind of contributions you make for the lifespan of your life, rather than seeing it like this kind of mechanized entity and disposable. I think many times comes along with that kind of industrialization. So I think what we're then talking about here, and I realise that I feel like I'm rambling, but then thoughts are just disseminating out of my head, so I gotta just go with it. So I feel that then when you're coming out with them, that it has to be this intergenerational, not just in terms of like that it's intergenerational, that you have multi-generations, which obviously is the clear define of that, but it's intergenerational in terms of yourself, in terms of the many future selves that you're going to occupy, in terms of that generational contribution, your life in its intergenerational evolution of the different stages that you are going to go through, for maid, mother and crone, if you like, going back to the old school, that's intergenerational within your own being and your own lived experience. So then it also has to reflect in the intergenerational collectivity that you're going to be taking forward for these kind of changes. And as such, you don't want any one of those stages of life to have some kind of redundancy where you can't contribute, because you can contribute and you do contribute. It's what you're doing. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely key. So, that shook and that shook and shake something loose as the first session of the day. I think that was one. I think other ones, say for example the Indigenous one, I mean that was the one, letters from, I'm trying to think of what it was called now, letters from Manga Indigena. Either way, I mean that is like almost like it's like a coalition of Indigenous communities from the Arctic all the way down to Patagonia. Very much it seemed quite weighted within, say, Central and South America maybe, but then not everyone was present that was there. But it shows you hearing these people talk. I mean, one young man, he said he was from an uncontracted tribe, or there'd been a process in terms of this contact and then coming out, I guess, over about 60 years. His grandmother was the first person to speak with, like, I want to say white man or not. So in that sense of the outsider, she was one of the first ones in terms of the tribe to make that connection, and very much matriarchal warriorship that he described, if I had that correctly. And he was extraordinary, and I don't know, he was so lithe. He seemed like it was like someone took someone out of nature, put them into a space that was so artificial, and they were like, what is this? And I don't think that was a comment for the others, or that was just my impression. Maybe I was romanticising the narrative very much. But when they were talking about the genocide happening in Brazil and different things, it was just, I think that was the one when I really wanted to bawl my eyes out, because the things they were talking of, this absolute disenfranchisement and marginalisation, but to the point of death. When you think of the definition of racism, that kind of level of disenfranchisement of legal, whatever, process to the point of death, and the way in which all that can be lived. I mean, that racialisation is there, I think, and I think we still have this kind of racialisation of nature, and they were the manifestation of it. And so in some ways, some of the closest. Therefore, I think that racialisation of the Indigenous is so apoplectic. It makes me apoplectic. It's so apocalyptic. Is so absolute. And as they described in their experience, and they were very clear of their language and their words, genocidal in that aspect. I mean, enslavement, in terms of industrialised enslavement that we talk about, that was genocidal, massively genocidal. I mean, that was a global genocide of a people's. And we still see that today in contemporary practice of enslavement, unfortunately, which, it boggles the mind. From when I heard of that Slavery International, when they think there's about 41 million people that are currently enslaved, and then with climate change and the displacement making more people vulnerable to that practice, so they expect that number to grow exponentially. And I think, they talked about wind farms, governments giving permission for wind farms on Indigenous lands, no free prior informed consent, as they said. I think this is about territories as well. And, interestingly, I think what's interesting about that is then, from, if I got this right, from their societal structures and the way that they contractually live with nature and themselves, or whatever they're specific to their context, they're then having to change and adapt to the governmental system. Many times of replication, say Western systems, since colonialism obviously, then, to something that is anathema to them in terms of their living and construction of living. So then what you then have is they have to adapt and change to perform, to live within the current system in terms of its legalities, policy, government, social, all these different kinds of things. But yet you're losing them because they don't want you to give you those rights. But yet, it's, they have to move, they have to change their paradigm of living to be able to use the mechanisms to be able to to be able to protect their lands and their ways of life, and nature itself, which is the central protagonist within this. It's the core, it's the being, it's the essence, it's the divinity that's at the heart of all of this. And I think the divinity of nature is a key thing here. I think with the Enlightenment, we saw that break with faith, and we saw that break with nature, and one of the cleanest cuts made was that with divinity. Not trying to say the church isn't dogmatic. I mean, Jesus Christ, some of the things that many organised systems are responsible for is something else. And that, that religious dogma and everything else that came anathema to the Enlightenment and modern science and all these kind of things has also eroded that divine nature and context, which can be one of the most powerful things for informing how you live your life, for informing your value system. And I'm not talking about necessarily religion, I'm talking about just in terms of value systems, by that which you hold to be divine. Whether that's your family, whether that's your work, whether that's your practice, your vocation, whatever it is, whatever stimulates you to the point that it's divine. It has a divine resonance with you, where you have the radiant glow. Do you know what I mean? I've always loved that. It's the perfect gold afro, isn't it? That radiance that you have in those, that you have in so many, Christian paintings and things. It shudders through all of that. It shudders through all their words, I thought. And I was just blown away by them. And I was thinking, how do I help here? How do I support? And how do I link? And it's something that I will be writing to them. But I was just really trying to think about the things that they were asking for when they were talking about consumption. And to cut down on consumption, I thought, do we even know what that is anymore? In the sense that the way in which the standing of living that we have and the level of consumption they may be speaking of, is that even something that's conceptual? Not as in less presents, so don't use plastic or whatever, but if that would be say energy usage. Not that you're particularly rampant, but you know what I mean? But if you were talking about cutting down literally on the amount of energy systems that that you consider essential within your home, if that meant cutting down limited miles per year, for example, if you're a driver, if that meant all different kinds of things. I wonder if, in terms of the standards of living and the normalization of them, I wonder how, and I don't know, because the conceptions from different people's perspective, the subjectivity that's inherent within that is so, to understand that. I mean, that takes deep kind of conversation in terms of those workings. So I was wondering questions like this, into coming here, because, they made that specific reference, he came to the land of the white man to speak to you, whatever. And I just thought, God, that land of the white man, just that sentence alone linked back to so many hundreds of years or whatever of colonialism and empire and this consistent juggernaut of domination and consumption and different things. And I was just I don't know, I don't know, can you ever really give that up? I wonder. And you think, if I think of abolition, everyone got paid for that one. That's the biggest payout we've ever done. I don't know now of the pandemic, and things, but that was the biggest payout we've ever done. We only finished paying that off in, 2013, something like that, for the abolitionist movement, when everyone was compensated. And, the slaves got their freedom, but they weren't giving them futures. Different thing entirely. You know what I mean? That was but you can't go anywhere. So you still got to go back to the same plantations and things that you were before. Even try and get this with trying. Each generation, a little bit of step, a little bit of step, a little bit more space, a little bit of sovereignty, a little bit of agency, a little bit more each time. But when you read about that transition, I was reading about it in the Barbados book we've got. You know what I mean? The previously enslaved are described as lazy and different things, but they're happy, are they? This pageantry that they are lazy now, they don't want to work and stuff, and it's very interesting. But I just wonder, in terms of truly these kind of roots of power of the things that are happening at COP in that blue zone and things, and it's just when you've extracted so much from all over the world, from so many countries, to turn around and tell them not to use the fossil fuels, not to have, essentially say, you can't have the same future I've had, but now it's not about me, it's not because I own you, it's not because I dominate you, but now it's about the environment. That's why you can't do it, it's not about me. But yeah, are you going to give up your privileges to enable them to get to the same point as you, so they then don't have to rely on them? Because if you're telling people not to progress themselves or enable themselves or and develop themselves in the same way that you did using their resources, that now that they're doing it for themselves it's not okay, how can you say that without having a veritable offer of how they're also going to be enfranchised and empowered, so we're all at the same level, so no one's dependent on those kind of things? Because that, I mean, from what I heard or what I'm hearing, that did not happen. I don't know if it ever would. And I wonder whether people have already made this particular, like, well, so-and-so goes, so-and-so goes, so-and-so goes, we can survive. And it's like, well, I mean, that's a game that we've been playing, I think, for hundreds of years. I think colonialism's that, you know what I mean? I mean, enslavement was that. You're disposable, we can afford not to have you on this earth. That's why we can mechanise you and take these things. Do you know what I mean? We've seen that in so many places where people are still enslaved today. That's why, whether it's like barely any wages or whatever it is, lots of different things that inform the economics and culture and migration, all these different kinds of things that happen. But we live in a world where lives are disposable and there is redundancy about people, and it's not enough to necessarily always stimulate people for change if they have to change. And I find that difficult. I mean, what is it that I'm willing to change? How far am I willing to go? I think these are questions that you have to ask yourself, but it's very hard questions to answer. I'm not a bloody saint. You know what I mean? Like, how do you figure that out? Oh, it's hard. It's hard to see where the line is in terms of your radical nature, natural nature. I don't know. I gotta go a minute and pick this up.